In 1914, the Ottoman Empire covered roughly 1.8 million square kilometers, from Damascus to Jerusalem, from Baghdad to Ankara. Approximately 20 million people lived under the authority of the government in Constantinople. In October 1914, following a secret alliance with Germany and a series of naval actions against Russia, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. That decision would mark the twilight of the empire. When the Central Powers collapsed 4 years later, the Ottoman state was dismantled by the Allies, and the new borders created back then still exist in the Middle East today. Turkish tribes settled in Anatolia in the late 13th century, and from that foothold they built what would become one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. By the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, it had reached its peak, controlling parts of the Near East, North Africa, and the Balkans. The turning point came in 1683, when Ottoman forces were repelled at the gates of Vienna. Led by Polish King Jan III Sobieski and backed by the legendary Winged Hussars, this ignited a long, gradual period of retreat and decline for the empire. Through the 19th century and into the 20th, the empire continued to shrink. It lost most of its Balkan and African territories. Yet on the eve of the First World War, it remained a Mediterranean power, controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the coastline of Anatolia, and its Arab provinces, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. The Empire of 1914 was no nation-state. Within its borders lived Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, Circassians, Laz, Assyrians, and that list barely scratches the surface. Sunni Islam was the dominant faith, but Shia Muslims, Orthodox and Catholic Christians, Jews, and a dozen smaller communities all had their place in this patchwork. Sultan Mehmed V held the throne and the title of Caliph. In practice, he held little else. The men who actually ran the empire were Enver Pasha at the War Ministry, Talat Pasha at the Interior. Following a secret alliance with Germany and a series of naval actions against Russia, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. The calculation was strategic: weaken France, Britain, and Russia, the three powers with significant interests in the region. Britain had occupied Egypt since 1882 and controlled Aden, while exercising influence over parts of southern Arabia, including Kuwait. France had deep financial and political investments in Syria, what it called the Levant. Both powers held stakes in the Ottoman Bank and were intent on securing the Suez Canal, while becoming increasingly interested in the region's petroleum resources. Oil had already been discovered at Abadan in 1908, near the Iranian border with Iraq and Kuwait, and British planners were well aware of the petroleum potential of the surrounding region. Russia had its own ambitions. Constantinople and the Straits had been on its wish list for generations. In 1915, the Allies attempted a landing at the Dardanelles. The Ottomans held their ground. What the Allies expected to be a quick breakthrough turned into one of the worst military disasters of the entire war. Inside the empire, repression intensified. Arab political leaders were arrested or exiled. Pontic Greeks and Assyrians were driven from their homes, killed, or left to die on forced marches. In spring 1915, the Young Turk government ordered the deportation and massacre of the Armenian population. Estimates range from roughly 800,000 to 1.5 million. In 1916, the British tried a different approach, encouraging armed revolt within the empire itself. Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, led an Arab guerrilla campaign against Ottoman forces, with British support and British promises of post-war independence. Even as the Arab revolt was underway, British and French diplomats were quietly planning a very different future for the region. In May 1916, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot drew up a secret agreement. In the event of an Allied victory, the Middle East would be divided into zones of direct control and influence, a zone of direct French control, coastal Syria, and present-day Lebanon, a French sphere of influence, inland Syria, a zone of direct British control, southern Mesopotamia, including the Basra region, a British sphere of influence, areas of Iraq, Palestine, and the land corridor toward the Mediterranean, an international zone, Palestine, especially around Jerusalem and the holy sites. Russia gave its approval, and Italy accepted the agreement through a separate arrangement the following year. The Balfour Declaration added another layer. Britain promised to support the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. By 1917, the Sykes-Picot Agreement had been exposed, published by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. The agreement was set aside, at least in its original form. When Bulgaria signed a ceasefire in September 1918, the Allied Army of the Orient had a clear land route to Constantinople. The Ottoman military position became impossible to hold. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros. The post-war settlement for the Ottoman Empire was negotiated at the Paris Peace Conference and formalized in the Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920. The treaty proposed a drastic partition of the empire. Much of the Arab world moved toward British and French direct foreign control, while Anatolia was divided into zones of influence and territorial loss. Western Anatolia, including Smyrna, was to go to Greece. In the east, the agreement promised independent states for both Armenians and Kurds. Constantinople and the Straits were to be placed under international control. In the end, none of this happened. The whole thing was replaced by a new deal, the Agreement of Lausanne. For most of the Turkish population, the agreement was unacceptable. Mustafa Kemal, a career military officer who had distinguished himself at Gallipoli, organized resistance from Ankara, establishing a rival center of power. His nationalist forces defeated the Armenian, French, Italian, and Greek armies, one after another. However, the Italians, while formally signatories to the Sèvres Agreement, had actually been supporting Kemal's nationalists. They eventually evacuated Antalya peacefully in 1921, having secretly supplied Kemal's forces. On November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. Kemal and the Allies signed a new deal in Lausanne on July 24th, 1923. Sèvres was dead. 3 months later, on October 29th, 1923, Turkey was declared a republic, and Mustafa Kemal became its first president. France and Britain kept their mandates in the Middle East. Greece lost its Anatolian territories and was forced to absorb over 1 million refugees, an event Greeks remember as the Great Catastrophe. In exchange, approximately 350,000 to 400,000 Muslims left Greece for Turkey in a compulsory population exchange. The biggest losers were the Armenians and the Kurds. Neither obtained an independent country. The western Armenian lands were absorbed into Turkey, while the east remained under Soviet control. The Kurds ended up split between Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. No country of their own, no borders that were theirs. The map was redrawn, but the people living on it were never asked. Many Arab populations were denied much of the independence they believed had been promised. In Palestine, the commitment to a Jewish national home generated immediate and lasting tension with the Arab majority. The Kurds, split across multiple countries, remained stateless. The surviving Armenian state became part of the Soviet Union, while large Armenian communities remained scattered across the Middle East and beyond. The lines drawn in the aftermath of the First World War did not correspond to the aspirations of the people living within them. Many of the conflicts that define the Middle East today have their roots in exactly that gap between what was promised and what was delivered, between the borders drawn in Paris and the realities on the ground.